telling us, or like more like bringing us through what's the US market like, okay, at 1 o'clock today. So before we start, or before I pass it over to Ms. Ashley, are you guys curious about what's the background of Ms. Ashley? Or some of you already know what's the background? No? No? Are you guys curious? Are you guys curious? Yes. Thanks. Thanks for the reaction. At least I know some of you guys had lunch, okay? So, a little bit background about Ms. Ashley. Ms. Ashley is actually from the International Wood Products Association that's stated here, which is also known as IWPA. So for the benefits, for you guys that are not too sure what IWPA is the leading trade association for the international wood products industry in North America. And Ms. Ashley here is a government relation professional with experience in international trade. She has also represented the Association of IWPA at multiple international meetings. So without further ado, are you guys wonder what Ms. Ashley gonna bring us to? Okay, so I'm not gonna drag anymore. So let's pass the floor over to Ms. Ashley to brief us about the US market. Are you guys ready? Okay.
Thank you so much. I've never had someone hype up an audience so well. So I know there were some audio issues earlier on. If anyone in the back has any issues hearing, just raise your hand at any point, okay? So thank you for the kind introduction. I was a lobbyist for the International Wood Products Association about a decade ago and have lobbied for a bunch of different organizations since then. So I've been very involved in US politics. I've now stepped out of that a little bit to head up the International Wood Products Association. But we're going to get into some good political stuff later, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about Congress, about some of the state legislatures, about some of the regulatory agencies, and how they impact our industry. Wow, thank you so much. So, she gave a pretty good introduction about what IWPA is already. We're the leading, trade association in North America, but that doesn't really tell you what we believe in. We want to build acceptance and demand in North America for globally sourced wood products from sustainably managed forests. Now, there's a couple keywords in there that I want to pull out. One is globally sourced wood products. In the United States, there can be some negative reactions sometimes to imported products. We work with policymakers, with folks that have demand in the US, with consumers, to help them understand that there are a lot of different wood products around the world, and just because it's from the United States doesn't necessarily make it better. It will depend on what you want to use it for. And then of course, sustainably managed forests. As we just heard from our previous speaker who did a wonderful job about talking about the future of the wood products industry here, that's something we have to think about globally. So the sustainably managed forest is something we really try to emphasize. So I won't go through all this too much, but just know a couple things about us. We have an annual magazine that goes to designers, interior decorators, specifiers, to help them understand what these products can look like once you actually use them. We do an annual convention, which MTC actually always brings a great delegation to and comes to speak at. And then of course we have weekly updates for all of our members that talk about what's going on in the industry. So here are the 4 things I'm going to talk about, hopefully kind of briefly today. The current state of the U.S. wood market, a little bit about the U.S.-China trade war, the Vietnam anti-dumping countervailing duty case, and then U.S. deforestation policy as a whole. Now, we'll warn you as we move into the statistics, IWPA does not maintain statistics like this, but we do have a very good friend at the Hardwood Market Report who's agreed to let us use some of their data. So if you have questions about any of the data that you're seeing here, I'm happy to connect you with them and they can go more in depth. So we've got some good news. We all remember those rough days of COVID, right? Where there were supply chain disruptions and it was really hard to get product out of anywhere and into anywhere else. And so you saw obviously a lot less imports there, but there's been some good uptick since then, as you are all probably way more aware of than even I am. So a lot of record highs when it comes to United States imports from abroad, which is great news for our industry, right? We're rebounding. there's that record low during 2020. I can say, having been in the United States during COVID, it was hard to get just about anything, not just wood products. There were, months delays at ports. You guys have probably all seen the pictures of container ship after container ship waiting on the water. We've had some labor disruptions as well, even continuing to the current day when you look particularly on the West Coast. We've had rail issues. So there are a lot of reasons why even sort of coming out of COVID, you've still seen some of those delays in getting products to market. Again, you're seeing that uptick again as we go 21, 22, not where it used to be, right? But again, trending in the right direction, which is great for us. Now, I want to talk a little bit about broader economic trends, because this is something that obviously really really impacts imports into the United States. So you have new home starts, right? And this in particular is really interesting to me because I came on to IWPA in 2010, right? A couple years after the 2008 crash, which hit all of us, but especially, in the United States, I can say personally, it hit us really hard. And you saw sort of the same data then, which is a lot lower home starts compared to how it had been in the past. Instead of building new homes, a lot of Americans were fixing up the ones they had, right? So they wouldn't buy a new house, but they might put in a new deck, right? They might do some remodeling. And so you're seeing that those home starts during 2020, 2021, 2022, especially now, there's still talk of, is the US in a recession? Are we going into a recession? There is not a lot of consumer confidence. So you're seeing that tick up a little bit from where it was in 2020, 2021, but it's still not up to where I think it could or should be. Okay, again, see, you're seeing that uptick in redesign and remodeling. People are much more comfortable spending a little bit of money in putting in a new kitchen, in upgrading something in their home than they are in moving. I know people are taking pictures, so I'm trying not to run through these too quick. Likelihood of recession in 2023. So this is from early April here, but I think it's probably still pretty accurate. If you go to America and you pick any city and you pull 10 people on the street, you would get very different reactions from every single person about whether we're in a recession, whether we're headed for a recession, whether we're coming out of a recession. Now, if you listen to politicians, and I do not recommend that you do, every one of them will probably say something different based on their political party, right? So the White House, the Democrats who are currently in power, they're going to say, oh, it's not really a recession, it's just a little bit of an economic, bump is one of the terms I've heard. Oh, it's just a bump in the road, right? If you talk to the Republicans, they're like, oh Lord, everything is burning, it's all over, put us in power, we'll fix it all, right? So there's not really unity when you talk to, at sort of the policy level, whether we're in a recession or headed for one. If you talk to an American on the street, a lot of it is going to depend on their particular pocketbook, right? Like how much money they have, how comfortable they feel. I will say, I've seen prices go up at the grocery store dramatically, right? And that hits people every day. When you used to be able to buy eggs for $1 less, that matters. And it matters more sort of the lower down the economic ladder you go. So you're going to see a lot of polling. You probably have seen a lot of polling, but I will just put a grain of salt with all of them, that it really depends on who you're talking to. All right, so let's talk a little bit about everybody's favorite subject in the United States if you're in Congress, and that's China. So I'm not going to go through all these quotes, because you guys can definitely read them, but what I am going to do is talk a little bit about the political realities that we see. So we, in the United States, have a very divided government right now. I was talking with someone earlier, a single person can hold things up because the margins of votes are so tight in both the House and the Senate, our upper and our lower chamber. So right now, our House of Representatives is held by the Republicans, and you have Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and he is head of a very divided Republican Party. You have people that are more moderate, that really want to get some things done. You have some people that are sort of, it really depends on the issue. And then you have some people that are very, very far right. And if any of you paid attention to US political news earlier this year, Speaker McCarthy took days to be elected leader of the Republican Party, which is something that has not happened in decades. Like, it is a very unprecedented thing for him to have such a divided caucus. But one of the few things that does unite his caucus and, quite frankly, Congress is when you talk about China. There is a lot of anti-China sentiment in the in US politics in general. And it's not just at the federal level, you see it going down to the state level. So Speaker McCarthy has a quote here about how the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest geopolitical threat of our lifetime. And this is something that some Democrats agree with him on. And there was a task force in 2020 that was led by the Republicans that looked at sort of China holistically, right? Not just when it comes to our industry, but overall. And one of the things that they really asked for at that time was for our Department of Commerce to continue and expand enforcement actions. And I think that while this was just a report, right, it wasn't a law, we've really seen the Department of Commerce take that to heart. Now, whether it was something they were planning on doing anyway or not, right, it is something that DOC, or Department of Commerce, has been very active in moving investigations forward and is constantly looking for ways to ding China in AD/CVD. And then over on the Democratic side, because this is not just a Republican thing, you have Senate Majority Leader Senator Schumer, who's led an anti-China push. There was a big package, about a year and a half ago now. And while it was ultimately sort of pared back, it's really been focused more on the technology side of things. It had a lot of Democratic votes. This is a bipartisan push, right? It isn't just Republicans, it isn't just Democrats, it's both parties that are anti-China. And this is actually fairly new, this was as of a couple weeks ago. Senator Schumer has announced that he actually wants to do another anti-China bill. And he's got some topics here. Now, none of these are specifically on trade when it comes to, whether it's our industry or anything else. But it is important to note, and any of you that have ever watched US politics will know this, that once you have a bill that starts moving, everybody who has something that they want to get done will try to pile on, right? Because we have so few bills that move through our Congress now that a single bill is not narrow usually. So I and my team are going to be watching this very closely, because if you have a China bill that starts moving, there are going to be a lot of other things that will get shoved on there, and I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more impacts to us in that, whether it's, that GOP recommendation, right, from 2020 that Department of Commerce is empowered to move forward. That's something I could see getting tacked on. So we're going to be keeping a very close eye on this. There's no guarantee it's going anywhere. The U.S. presidential election is coming up next year. You guys have probably seen a few news stories about that. And historically, in a presidential election year, once you hit May-ish, May of 2024, it gets really hard to get anything done because people don't want to take hard votes that they then have to defend when they are home with their constituents. So, again, very bipartisan. There's not going to be a lot that happens this year in terms of bills, other than a few must-pass pieces of legislation. But again, back to that earlier point of piling on, right? It is very possible that a bill moving through Congress on something totally unrelated to this could have things that are added onto it. So IWPA, we do have a lobbyist on staff, Joe O'Donnell, if any of you have met him, and we have a firm in DC that we've actually hired a few years ago now to help us because there are so many issues that we have to watch. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on this. So I want to briefly talk about the Vietnam anti-dumping countervailing duty case. So I started August 26th of last year in this role, and my first day on the job, like I didn't even have keys yet, I hadn't been to the office, they flew me to a trade show, and I'm, I don't have business cards, right? I'm starting to meet people, and Joe pulls me aside and he's like, we gotta hop on this conference conference call, and I'm like, I've been in this job 3 hours. Like, what are we going to talk about? And it was one of our members, Jeff Grimson from Mallory and Grimson, who's a lawyer who's involved in this sort of world, briefing us on the Vietnam case. And I have to say, that was a significantly difficult onboarding. But it has been something that we have spent, and I have spent a lot of time since then on. Now, IWPA is a trade association, right? We're not actually trading. So there's the focus for us when we're talking with agencies has been on the procedural aspects here, right? Because I'm not on the ground, I'm not in any of these factories, I can't say for sure one way or the other, but what I can say is that Department of Commerce is not following its own procedure, and that this is going to be problematic further down the line if this is allowed to stand. So we had gone to Department of Commerce in 2020 and had received a written letter from them that they asked us to send out to the industry, and they specifically defined what was in scope and what was not. It's on Department of Commerce letterhead. It was official, like this was a public document. And so we sent it out to our membership, and people made decisions, business decisions, based on that guidance. Well, we all know what happened, right? That scope has been drastically altered from what Commerce told us it was. And so from our perspective, we then pushed back and said, no, you told us in 2020 what the scope was. And now you're trying to change the rules of the game retroactively. Now, my membership is a lot of small businesses. We've got a few big companies, right? But a lot of them are small businesses. They're 5-person companies, they're 10-person companies. And if they base their business decisions on what Department of Commerce said, well, I've got a few of them now that are looking at tens of millions of dollars in retroactive duties that there's no way they could have known about. So we engaged immediately with Department of Commerce and with Customs and Border Protection. And then I have also worked with the Small Business Administration in the past, which is an agency in the US government that is specifically tasked with helping small businesses. Because this issue, in my mind, really has a huge small business component. So we've done a lot of meetings, we've sent a lot of letters. But talking to government agencies is not normally enough. So we started doing visits with members of Congress. I think, again, within like the first week I was there, we were at the time meeting virtually. They weren't allowing people up yet, but meeting virtually with members of Congress. And we take IWPA members with us. So if we have an IWPA member that is a constituent business, then we will have them join the meeting so that we can share, here's the procedural stuff, and then they can share their specific story. So we've worked with members of Congress. They've done this reach out, had them reach out on our behalf to Commerce and CBP. Good, I updated this just in time. We're now on the 8th extension. They, in December of 2022, released sort of a path forward that fixed some of our problems, but not all. So we immediately countered with a letter saying like, hey, you got 50% of the way there, great job, but like, let's go 100%. We're continuing those meetings with members of Congress, but again, Commerce is now set to July 14th. And Joe and I were talking before I left, he's like, oh, they've got to make a decision this time. And I was like, what's to stop it from being the 9th? Like, what makes the 8th special, right? So people keep asking me, when do I think a decision's gonna come down? You can throw a dart at a calendar and your guess will be as good as mine. Commerce, I think, has no idea what the path forward is, and so they just keep putting it off, hoping that somehow they'll figure it out. Which is exactly what you want to hear from a regulatory agency, right? So there is pressure from our companies, and not just our companies, but some others as well, for Commerce to, particularly when it comes to small business, but in business in general, be lenient with folks that thought they were doing the right thing, right? This isn't going to punish China, it's going to drive US businesses out of business. So continuing to be active. If you're an IWPA member, come talk to me. I would love to set up meetings to have you talk with members of Congress or with agencies. So just find me afterward. And last but not least, US deforestation policy. If I had $1 for every time someone asked me about this, I would not be in front of you, I would be on a beach in Aruba right now. This is a very a very popular topic. People are paying a lot of attention to it, right? So there were two big calls for comments last year. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with how the US regulatory policy works, when a policy is being considered or they want to know something, right, they put out something called a call for comment. And it will be this really long document, usually with a lot of questions, and you will be able to respond within a certain amount of time. So there was the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, that was in January of this year, and they are looking at ways to counter conservation crime. Now this isn't wood specific, but wood is a part of it, specifically listed as a part of this. And they weren't focused on specific solutions that they were asking for feedback on, but rather wanted to know ideas that the industry had about what criminal activity looks like, how you can counter it, and then if there are ways, whether through community outreach or funding, that those crimes can be stopped, right? The second one, and I have it second even though it was earlier because I think it's more important and I want to spend a little bit more time on it, is this is the U.S. Department of State. They had a call that ended in early December of last year, and it was focused on combating international deforestation associated with commodities. There were a lot of problems with this, and I'm being very diplomatic when I phrase it like that. Talk to me at the happy hour reception if you want, and I'll tell you my real opinion. But there were no definitions really for us to react to, right? So they're like, well, there shouldn't be illegal deforestation. Okay, great. I don't think I know none of us here want illegal deforestation, but what does that mean, right? What is illegal? What is deforestation? They wanted to remove legal deforestation from supply chains. So I'm in the US, right? And my family owns timber in South Carolina, right? One of the states in the South. And my dad will regularly sell, he'll sell and buy. And so if he sells or buys something, and let's say development comes to that area, because it's kind of rural, but it's growing, it's near a big city, right? If he was like, yeah, I'll sell an acre so that you can put up a convenience store or a grocery store or whatever, and so they're gonna cut down the trees, that's legal deforestation, and that wood becomes illegal. Now, of course, the United States isn't thinking like that, right? It's not domestic, it's international. So if that happens in any other country, that wood is then illegal. And what about if you have a plantation, right? Like, you're gonna maybe clear the plantation, right? Whatever type of tree you have, that's how you harvest, and then you replant, that's illegal wood. And so this is problematic for so many reasons. And setting aside even how fundamentally wrong that is to think about wood, think of the chain of commerce, right? So at a U.S. port, when that enters, is the customs person supposed to know exactly where this wood was harvested and what type of harvest was it, right? Was it selective and therefore it's fine? Was it someone that sold some land and something's being built on? Well, it's not fine anymore, right? There is no way to track that, and it puts the U.S. in the position of having to interpret other countries' laws and decide if they like them. Because if that's, say, legal in Malaysia, well, the U.S. would be like, well, we don't like it, so it might be legal in Malaysia, but no, it's illegal. That is, if anything says ITC case, just in bright letters, that does to me. And the retroactivity, again, the U.S. seems to love this retroactivity. Retroactivity of both legal and illegal deforestation through 2020, and then traceability of every wood particle back to the stump. So, not easy, not as difficult if we're bringing in a giant log, right? But what about if it's furniture, particle board? I guess a lot more difficult immediately. So IWPA commented strenuously. We actually pulled together a group of our members that helped me write these comments because we wanted to be very thorough. The last thing I want to talk about, and I was hoping I'd have a good update, and I don't, is this New York State bill. So as many of you know, we have 50 states, several territories, and all of them can pass their own legislation. California does it all the time, right? New York York has started to become one of what we call bellwether states. So when California passes a law that has to do with environmental work, right? A lot of times you see other states start to look at the same thing, and then sometimes even at the federal level. Well, New York, which is on our East Coast, is starting to become one of those leaders when it comes to bills when you look at that Northeast area, right? So New York will pass something, and then Massachusetts, and then Rhode Island, and then Vermont, right? And then maybe Maine. So the New York State bill, this is the New York Tropical Deforestation Free Procurement Act. And it requires companies that are contracting with the state that they do not contribute to tropical primary forest degradation or deforestation directly or through their supply chains. So I want to pull your attention down to the third bullet point here. So basically, every contract that the state agency or the state at all enters into that includes the procurement of any product compromised wholly or in part of a tropical forest, that contractor, so that person supplying that product, and I'll move out of the way because I see people taking some pictures, that product, they have to certify that it was not grown from, derived, harvested, reared, or produced on land where tropical deforestation or tropical primary forest degradation occurred on or after January 1st, 2023. So you're going to ask some person supplying, I don't know, the rental of wooden chairs to a New York State event to certify that no wood in that chair came from land that had tropical deforestation or tropical primary forest degradation. And again, not just deforestation, degradation, which is not defined well. So I was hoping that because New York State was set to go out on June 8th, right, their session was going to be done, I was hoping I would get to stand in front of you and say, yes, this bill is dead, we're good. They extended their session. I was checking this morning before I came here. I think this is probably on track to pass. They're taking a 2-week break right now. They went until yesterday. And the bill basically was at the final stage before it goes to a final vote. Now, there are a couple sort of steps beyond that. It has to have a final vote in their Senate, I believe, and then go to their governor for signature. So IWPA, I was messaging Joe early this morning, I think late last night for him, saying we've got to get some members that are now going to have to, try to contact the governor, try to get to senators. I think that this is probably on track to pass. Now, there are a couple options once legislation goes through, right? Like, you can always have someone that sues over it, which is a possibility because it's very poorly drafted. And it is going to have to go to the regulatory agency, which will then sort of put out that call for comment. So there, I think, are going to be some slight bites at this apple, but this is on track to go through. And then I just want to briefly mention, I'm not going to go through all this just for timing reasons. There was a California bill, and I don't know that I have the year on here. It was like a year or two ago. Oh, it's 2021. I do have it on here. And this is basically the same thing as New York. And interesting, it passed, and the governor vetoed it. And the majority, they didn't have the majority needed to sort of overcome the veto and send it back. And he specifically vetoed it because of the burdens to small businesses. So when we are going to the governor, and I've done these sort of meetings before in previous jobs, right? You can have meetings with the governor once a bill passes and basically encourage him to veto it. But we're going to be pointing out if California vetoed this bill, you guys should really think about maybe doing the same. So that's something, again, if you're an IWP member or you're interested in this, even if you're not, I'm happy to talk more about it with you. That is all I have, but I am totally open for questions if anyone has any. Whether it's anything I've talked about, other things you want to know about, stories about Congress.
Donald Trump then be the next president?
Oh God, I didn't say anything about presidential politics. I have no idea. Again, getting back to that idea of when is commerce going to do something, you could spin a wheel at this point and have as good a chance predicting how any of this is going to go. He's certainly going to be a force to be reckoned with, I think, in U.S. politics for a long time to come. I think a lot of Republicans at this point are assuming that he will be the nominee. The Democrats are praying for it. Because Biden, anyone that's seen polling, Biden's not polling particularly well. A lot of Democrat people that give money and people that volunteer don't love Biden. So I think Biden's camp is hoping that they'll set up sort of a 2020 redo, and it will be Biden versus Trump. And Biden is hoping that, you know, the same people that voted for him and against Trump will do so again, and then he can sweep to victory. But I don't know, with the indictments, some of you may have seen, you know, Trump was indicted. It sounds like there's more indictments coming, so we'll see. I was in no way a comprehensive answer, but any other questions folks have about anything I've talked about?
Given the Lacey Act in the US and how that's been pivotal to the development of legal legislation across Europe, Australia and elsewhere, what's the status of the Lacey Act at the moment?
That's a great question. So I assume everybody here, if you're doing business with the United States or indeed with many other countries, are familiar with the Lacey Act, right? It from the U.S. perspective, precludes the importation of illegally sourced wood or wood products. That the act was passed to deal with wood in 2008. There have been no amendments. Now they have sort of done this very slow rollout of the declaration. So from the time it passed and went into effect, you couldn't import illegally sourced wood or wood products, end of story, right? It was illegal. But the declaration component that you have to have accompanying that has been a slower rollout. So I know they're getting ready to do phase 7, which is basically furniture. It's basically almost everything else except paper, I believe. That phase 7, I think, is they're going to be releasing something on that by the end of this year. So you're probably looking at implementation mid of 2024. That's, I think, the most significant update I have on Lacey. When I was at IWPA in 2010, I was part at that time of an effort to repeal the wood products portion. The landscape has totally shifted in the last 10 years. That repeal is never, not in my lifetime anyway, happening. Because you have a lot of members that are very entrenched. They've built, you know, and as you've noted, the Lacey Act is seen as a standard that's used around the world. So the Lacey Act is something, as it is, I think will stay for a long time. There haven't been any efforts to change it. There have been efforts to better fund the enforcement agencies. There are a lot of environmental groups that have been, I'll say, not happy with the level of enforcement, with the pace of the rollout, and they want the U.S. government to be more aggressive, right? They want more importers that get their hands slapped or go to jail. There have been a few significant Lacey cases that have, you know, been very high profile. Gibson Guitars comes to mind, right? They have gone out to the big guys, and one of the things I've heard, not from an official source, so take this with a cup of salt at this point, is that they're going to be going after a lot more smaller folks now, because they've sort of gotten a couple of those landmark cases that everybody knows about it, and they really want to be able to drill down, but that all comes down to funding. And the U.S. government right now is not great about passing funding bills. So it's very unclear sort of what that financially is going to look like for the agencies that are tasked with Lacey Act enforcement, but it is something we're going to be continuing to keep an eye on. Any other questions? Well, I will be here the next couple days. I'm almost always dressed in bright colors, so you can easily find me. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone about anything I've talked about or IWPA or any other things that are on your mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms.Ashley. And thank you. So, it's very interesting sharing, right? I think that it's very informative, very interesting, and I actually hope to hear more. I'm waiting for more, but because of time constraint, we will have another section that's at 2 o'clock. But before I tell you guys who are the next speakers, trust me, it's just coincidence, okay? We did not arrange this in purpose, okay? Because next, we will have Mr. Li Pei-Sin, that's the Secretary General from the Conference Wood Professional Committee of Shanghai Timber Trade Association, which is the STTA from China. So he's going to share with us about the timber and furniture, who is more or less about the development of China in 2022. But this session is going to be conducting in Mandarin. So for those that's interested, you can drop by, same spot, same position. We did not move any place, so come back at 2 o'clock if you are interested to listen to the development of China in 2022, which will be conducted in Chinese.